Hello everyone back. I hope you enjoyed a lot the lunch break and had interesting talks. Happy to have you back here. Our next guest actually grew up in Belgium, lives in Bergen in Norway, just flew in for the conference, partly true. I admit to that. She holds a PhD in Information and Communication Science, is a researcher at the Department of Information Science and Media Studies at the University of Bergen in Norway, as well as a teacher for data journalism at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And actually, she will talk about AI in the newsrooms. A newsroom, they should care about journalism and good stories, and now we have data scientist people in there. How does that fit? Please, some warm welcome on stage, Laurence Dierickx.
Hello. So AI in journalism is pretty much a reality today. According to the World Association of Newspaper, around 50% of the newsroom are currently using AI systems or generative AI. So how do you use AI in journalism for a wide range of processes to speed up the workflows or to empower the business, I would say. So you have news detection, news discovery, social media analysis, audiovisual search engines, news verification, automated fact-checking, data and content analysis, and so on. But working with AI systems in a newsroom also implies that journalists have to work with computer and data scientists, which is not really something common in their way of working. One of the main issues is how to blend AI systems with journalism ethics and how to ethically use these systems. So ethics in journalism in AI is about respecting the truth, and it's also a matter of social responsibility. And the practices in journalism and in AI are related mostly to three main concepts, which are accuracy, objectivity, transparency, and as it is a matter of practice, it's a matter of epistemology. So it's about building interdisciplinarity, as I told you, because journalists are not the one anymore that produce the information, or at least on the whole information process. And so it requires a conjugation of computational thinking, which is about a process to solve problems, with a journalistic thinking, which is about reasoning, argumentation, rhetoric, contextualization, description, interpretation too, historical thinking, evaluation, and ethics. So it's important now to better clarify the concept, because there are some divergence, some discrepancy between this concept according the field in which the professionals are involved. And there are also some additional challenges with the rise of generative AI, which is definitely a game changer in the newsrooms. So accuracy is an indicator for quality and accountability, both in the two professional world. So in journalism, accuracy is a part of all of the ethical standards in Europe. And it covers the broader scope of truth, objectivity, fairness, transparency, credibility, and it refers to each stage of the process. So it's about presenting facts as they are, but it also includes some subjective factors, of course, because journalist is also a human being with his own reference. So in practice, accuracy is about verifying facts and ensuring sources' reliability. It's not quantifiable, and the assessment of accuracy in journalism just implies human judgment, and therefore subjectivity too. In data-driven journalism practices, accuracy is related to the data quality dimension, and it's much more connected to data science. It's about finding abnormal values, duplicates, the consistency of the data set, the level of comprehensibility, and so on. And data journalists tend to prioritize the quality of input data collection and curation. So in data in computer science, it's a bit different because it's a measurement, but it is also grounded in ethics. It's about the fairness and the accountability of the AI system. So it's, as you know, you're a data scientist, it's a measure to assess the model performance, but that's not the only measurement that is used. And it considers statistical patterns learned, and that's true that evaluating accuracy through the prism of the ground truth makes prediction pointless, but on the other hand, there are some explainability methods that were developed to assess the accuracy or plausibility of machine learning prediction without requiring this ground truth. But accuracy alone cannot guarantee the trustworthiness of the model of its correct or complete description. The new challenge, also the overall challenges in machine learning with accuracy is about using data set collected from Wikipedia. So it's really tempting for data and computer scientists to collect this kind of data because they are accessible. But the problem is that in journalism, they cannot be considered as a primary reliable source because they are not free from political bias, and it comes from users on who don't know anything about their level of expertise. The classifiers are also another problem because you can get unbalanced or irregularities in classification. So for instance, in automated fact-checking, you can find a wide range of classifiers depending on the model used, and you can have true, false, partially true, contradiction, compatible, and so on. And all of these labels are not really always documented. The dataset labeling methods and crowdsourcing is also really challenging because it depends also on the expertise of the people who will label the dataset, and it also involved human judgments. It is exacerbated with generative AI. Why? Because generative AI, like ChatGPT, use a wide range of sources gathered on the web, and it includes Wikipedia, user-generated content, political and religious-oriented pages, and so on. So that means that it is not free from bias. There is also a lack of accuracy in the outputs and the so-called hallucination that we could call errors, glitches, junk, or whatever. So, for instance, in a corpus of generated content produced with ChatGPT, we found that there were a lot of made-up facts that were added to the original prompt that we performed. That means that it is coherent, so could we call something that looks really coherent as an hallucination is just really fake content. And ChatGPT also provided some false and harmful statements about persons, which is also really problematic. So, objectivity is really a myth in journalism, but it is a part of the professional self-perception, both seen as an occupational norm and a part of the journalism culture. But objectivity is mostly impossible because there is this human bias behind, but it is explicitly mentioned in several codes of ethics as a synonym for impartiality, but also it is seen as a lever for trust. In data journalism practices, there are not objectivity because they mostly think that working with numbers make the facts more objective, and they obscure the subjectivity that contains the analysis, because data analysis is the free-form bias too. It depends on the question that you ask to your data. And it obscures also the possibility of using biased data. In fact-checking, this kind of objectivity is achieved through transparency, which is really pretty much much more than a standard. That's a requirement for all the organization. We are members of international fact-checking networks, and it's about opening the black box of journalism by exposing the sources and the methods to get the results. In data and computer science, you will see that objectivity is a kind of aura. So a lot of people in this area tend to oppose the objectivity of the computational process to the subjectivity of the journalist. It's just the belief that it is reliable, precise, and credible. But computer code fulfills also an editorial function on its own. It results from human decisions, and it implies human judgments and choices upstream the systems. And we have to also acknowledge that incomplete or biased data sets cannot be considered objective, and there is a need for assessing data quality to improve the data quality, but also to improve the outcomes in systems that have a strong dependency on data. Some algorithm can lead to false positive and negative, or to amplify bias. So even the readers of AI-generated contents published by the newspaper consider that these contents are more objective than the human written production. But it is here to say that all of this news content rely mostly on rule-based system. But that was before November last year, when we have this game changer with ChatGPT. So there are bias in the data collection and in the sources, bias in the annotation process. That's the question of the expertise of the poorly paid worker that who were hired to train ChatGPT's data set. And it's about also socio-cultural background, because when you hire people with cultural reference that are really different from those shared in Europe, it can also lead to potential other bias. So the sources influence the model and the values encompassed in the model. And in the answer provided by ChatGPT, there were also a lot of oriented answers that were reported with erroneous responses and made-up outputs, which is a big concern for journalism. And there are also the challenges about the service accuracy and reliability. So transparency is the third point that's really important to clarify among the professional. So transparency is about exposing the black box of journalists, but in a way it is a bit biased, because editorial choices will never be explained. You don't know anything about what's happening in the newsroom, in the editorial meeting, and so on. But it is seen as a substitute for truth, or fairness, or even the new objectivity. It infused a lot of new or trending journalism practice, and it is a part of the ethical standard, and in the US officially for years now. And there is only one ethical code that recognizes transparency in Europe, that's in the Flemish Belgium, and it is an update of their code that they released this year. It's also a level for trust or accountability, but as objectivity, it can also be seen as an idol because all cannot be explained. Sometimes transparency is not fully achieved. For instance, when you publish content that are not mentioned as being written by an AI-based system. So in data and computer science, that's a huge debate on how building ethical AI. But the problem, the limit of transparency is that, okay, expose the code, expose the algorithm at work. So will the people be able to understand it? There are also the proprietary protected code. You cannot access to it, and it is really restricted for complex models. So, and it is not necessary to assess the reliability because there is no guarantee of the trustworthiness of the result. Hence, explainability was proposed as an alternative to making more sense to the user. So it allowed the user to better understand how was made the decision-making process and the technical process. So it's also about providing these seeds of social values and moral ethics to understand how a given system reasons. And informing how algorithms are designed and implemented does not require transparency in any cases. There is also the other feature like interpretability to balance, I would say, transparency and explainability. But it's mostly a passive feature that allows users to understand the model and to make sense of it. So transparency with GAI. So machine learning data often lacks transparency, explainability of interpretability. There is a need for documentation, and it is critical for systems that rely on vast amount of data. By the way, a company like OpenAI does not provide any clue by itself on this data. No transparency on the data source, but also no transparency on the labeling and the training process. So opacity challenges the trustability of the outcomes, but thus opacity alone can explain the lack of trust in news content. So the last point that's important to consider is the fairness, because it's also something really important in data and computer science when it comes to think about ethical AI. So fairness in journalism is about honesty, privacy, professional distance, truth, and impartiality. It's about providing a well-balanced information to avoid bias and stereotypes. And in a way, it meets the machine learning concept of fairness because it concerns the absence of bias and an equal treatment. So bias can be related to the training data or the implicit human values of people involved in the programming, but mostly in the labeling. And it can be measured through accuracy, recall, precision, or even human evaluation. It's about explaining the how and the why and explaining the training data and the process at work. So that's much more related to this not deontological ethics, which is the part of philosophy of ethics, but the consequentialist ethics. So what will be the consequences of the decision that I will make as a human related to my decisions? So to conclude, the benefits to move towards each other in these separate fields that are promised to work much more together. It's promoting a social approach of technology that considers all the stakeholders, It's also a way to blend AI systems with journalistic values, which is something that is really demanded among journalists and among journalism scholars. It's about also developing more data and AI literacy among journalists, because they still lack of that. Favoring a mutual understanding is also a lever for building trust, and trust is really important in news information. However, the deontological lenses are perhaps the limits, because ethics is first and foremost a matter of practice. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laurence. We have time for like 1 or 2 quick questions. I have one. You mentioned source, the data source is a key. So the large language model we have today are trained by Wikipedia or the whole internet, which is full of.
Oh, yes.
So what's the solution? Who has the data? Who has it? Which company has it? How could we ever have a large language model trained with the data, with all these points you mentioned?
So yes, that's a really big issue, and I did not mention also the copyright issue, because 90% of the data are copyrighted. So the news publisher are thinking to sell license for training data, and I would say that it would be the best solution to benefit from reliable and accurate data to work on it. But from OpenAI, for instance, we have no clue how to do that with this tool, ChatGPT. Of course, if you use other models, then you can infuse more ethical in that, but journalists are not always the programmer, and sometimes they just use it as an end-to-end service.
So companies like Springer, we have to buy shares of these companies. They have to pay.
Perhaps, yes.
A question from the audience? One?
You kept mentioning during your presentation what different ethics criteria mean in journalism and what they mean in computer or data science. Do you think at the end of the day ethics appears to be a matter of interpretation, and our interpretation of this ethics criteria are shifting towards computer science criteria?
So I would say that it's obviously, yes, that's a matter of interpretation, but it's also a matter of practice. And as a practitioner, you don't ask yourself, do I behave ethically, and so on. But at least it will encourage to understand the requirement between each other. So I will provide you with a really good example. So I worked during my PhD thesis on the implementation of a news automation system for stock market news on the online coverage. So a company was hired to develop the system, but the journalists wanted to have their word to say, because they are the expert of, that's a really complicated area, you have to know well the domain. And there were a lot of misunderstanding between the people who developed the system and the journalists. They thought that it was not feasible to incorporate all of this demand, because they found that too subjective, too interpretative, and they said, so we have the value of the stock market and we have to stick on that. But the problem in stock market, for instance, you have just all of these contexts that explain why the values evolved during the day. And that was a really complicated work, and it lasted almost 3 years before being operational for this reason.
Thank you very much. We have to make here a stop. You will be around, hopefully. Here's
Yes.
a nice souvenir from Zurich.
Oh, thank you so much.
With your name on the bottle.
Wow.
So, a safe trip home. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Laurence.
Merci beaucoup.